Hello my brothers and sisters of the Order, welcome back to the Order. I am Celtic Templar, and yes, today y'all, we are going back to firearms, and today we are actually going back to one of my favorites that fires a 45 ACP round that is actually the Thompson. However, we're not just going to talk about one Thompson in particular, we're going to talk about all of them. Now, first we got to start off, what is a Thompson? Well, that's the major thing. We got to look at the designer, John T. Thompson, who actually designed it. In which Thompson, who actually created the, gun, he wanted to create a submachine gun for the United States military, especially seeing as though the Germans were using a submachine gun. So he had designed a type of design gun, which he first started off with the infamous Tommy gun, as we all know it. However, here's what most people don't understand about the Tommy gun. The Tommy gun, as we all know it, like from the 1920s model, this gun would not exactly be used by the United States Army. And originally, it would first be used by the United States Police Force. Major reason why is because they were trying to get a one-up on criminals. Major thing I have to put out here, y'all, that criminals were technically getting, or the bad guys were technically getting the good guns. And in such, police force had to crack down on them. And in such, that's where the Tommy gun comes in. Now, upon acquiring the earlier Thompson of the 1920s, or as is also known as Chicago typewriter, as it's always known, it would actually have a rate of fire of around 900 rounds per minute. That's a lot of rounds into such. In which it would actually either choose between a 100 round drum magazine or a 30 round stick magazine. This type of submachine gun would actually be used by the gangsters and police force both. However, gangsters were known to actually use the 100 round drum magazine especially. This can easily be remembered in the infamous, St. Valentine's Day massacre orchestrated by Al Capone. Now, one more thing we do have to understand is that the Tommy gun itself was kind of what you might call, in the earlier years of the wars and such, was kind of like a pray and spray for gangsters and police officers, especially in a police chase. And such, we can actually see these in many, gangster movies, especially from the 1920s and all that, especially from the black and white films, all that. Now, one thing I do have to put out here, though, is by this point in time period, the major thing is, the reason the United States Army didn't go with it was because of the fact they did not believe that another war would actually come back up, and two was the fact of how its design feature. In which this sounds really idiotic, yes, but one major reason was because of the fact of how big it was. It was a lot bigger than what the United States Army was wanting it to be. For example, if you were going to go jumping into the trenches of World War I, you needed a submachine gun, not a submachine carbine rifle, which is entirely different. Now, John Thompson had actually first created or designed the submachine gun in 1918. And in truth was created in late 1918 when the war ended. So in truth, the gun never saw World War I. So any of you guys that are fans of Battlefield 1, I'm sorry, that has to be put out there for you. But another thing I had to put out here, y'all, the reason why Thompson designed it to actually carry a 100 round or 50 drum magazine, especially, was kind of the major fact you don't want to actually run out of ammunition, especially when you're jumping into an enemy trench. So that's a major problem. But the 30 round stick magazines were probably the best idea that he could have gone with. Now, I have to put this out here, y'all. The United States weren't just the only, soldiers to actually, or United States Army, I should say, weren't the only ones to actually use it, nor were the police force. Especially to the fact that the submachine gun of the United States Army that was later on issued to them, guess which militaries used it before the United States? Pretty much every last one of them in Europe, especially that which were related to the Allies. We could easily see Great Britain, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and as well, some countries of Spain and Greece, Mexico, Vietnam, and Korea had also used them after World War II. And in such, we can see why, but I'll get to that very later. But yes, during the World War II, for example, especially during early years of World War II, from 1939, for example, to 1942, or 43 and 44, It's actually stated that Allied forces in World War II that were allied to the United States had actually used a submachine gun. We can easily see British commandos during World War II actually using the Thompson submachine gun in the deserts of North Africa. And as well, also during the Great Raid in France. This was a secret raid that actually failed entirely, but I'll leave a link down below if any of y'all know nothing about this raid. And in such, we have to understand that this submachine gun was used entirely by British commandos and as well Aussie forces, before them getting their hands on the Owen gun. Now, I had to put this out here, y'all. The earlier Thompson of the 1920s was the first model, but in truth, there were more design features. How do I put this? Well, this is what I want to put out here, y'all. During the early years, Roosevelt wanted the American forces to bulk up, especially MacArthur. In fact, MacArthur, which if none of y'all understand, was a U.S. Marine commander, and in fact, he had actually issued the Thompson to many squad commanders, which weren't originally happy. However, when the 1928 model came out, that changed everything. Now, I hear many people already, Templar, what the hell's a 1928? Are you just making this up? No, the 1928 model had, well, there are many variants of this, because the A1, A2, A3, A4, and such and such and such. This is just a metaphorical meaning for automatical, or in such of auto mode. If none of y'all know what that means, it means like the burst fire type motion, especially if you hold down the trigger. The 1928 would have somewhere between a 700 to 800 rounds per minute, so that's actually a heavy type of maximum type round, but yet it's lower than that of the 1921 Thompson that we all know from the gangster films. So it's kind of really cool, actually. Now, I want to put this out here, y'all. This was used by the United States Army from 1930s, I want to say the 1930s, somewhere around 34, 31, I want to say, and as well finally ended in 1971. But that's the thing, the United States Army went through at least 3 versions of Thompsons, and in such, that's how we have to understand it. Now, one thing I had to put out here, y'all, the Tommy gun especially, that we're going to first start off with, I'm talking about, this model was still being used by U.S. forces in the early years of the war. Now, the Tommy gun was first used by the police and the gangsters, then it was used by the United States Army and Marine Corps. Now, the Marines actually still kept using this type of version of submachine gun even into 1943. In fact, we can actually see this gun being used in the movie Windtalkers with Nicolas Cage, which is actually a really cool scene in the Solomon Islands when he's holding the Tommy gun, which you gotta love that design entirely. But this was actually the reason why the Tommy gun would later on be replaced, because of the fact of it somewhat jamming, so they had to fix it. And in fact, this was first issued by the United States Marine Corps to have it especially issued and fixed incredibly quickly. And, well, they wanted a new model. But the thing is, most of the time the United States Marine Corps got the older models, especially from 1920s to 1928 models. And that's actually kind of a really bad part in history, which brings us to the 1928. The 1928 model was used by a lot of America's allies. These were pretty much also Great Britain and all of World War II allies during World War II, especially with Great Britain and Canada and such, and, well, as I just said, but we had to understand that during the fighting in North Africa, in Sicily, and also in the invasion of Normandy, the United States military, British forces, Canadian forces, Aussies, and Australia and such, and New Guinea and all that, they would still be using the Thompson rather than using a Sten gun. In fact, I know you'll know what a Sten submachine gun is. Sten submachine guns were used by British paratrooper commandos, who of which used them because they were a lot easier to assemble. And as such, these things were, well, dirt cheap, and paratroopers weren't exactly expected to survive. You see my point? I know that really sounds messed up, but you gotta admit, it's like 50-50 if you're gonna come back alive, so what would be the point? So, yeah. Now, I want to put this out here, y'all. During the time in history of this supposed use of the firearm, we had to understand that during World War II, we have to see that Allies and the United States forces were technically still using the submachine gun because of the fact that it was, well, the Thompson was a really great gun, and it fired a heavy bullet of the 45 ACP. Now, this was until later on the, 1928 model was later on to be replaced by the M1A1. The M1A1 was the Army model that was issued to the United States Army, which, if none of y'all understand this, during World War II, apparently the Army got the better firearms before the Marines did. And we can easily see this in history because most of the time during the early years of World War II, the United States Marines were still using, well, firearms they were using during World War I. Especially with the Springfield, the 1918 Browning machine gun, and including some, old-fashioned 1918 BARs and, 1928 Thompsons, while the United States Army was using M1 Garands, 30 caliber machine guns, BARs, and such. You see my point. Which, that's what I have to put out here. So, why is the M1A1 different? Well, the M1A1, as we can tell the difference between this model would be the M1A1 on top, and this one on the bottom is the 1928. The difference is the fact that the cocking handle for the M1A1 is on the side, and the one for the Thompson 1928 I should say, would actually be on top. Now, the 1928 you could use somewhere between a 30-round stick mag or a 50-round drum magazine. Now, that is a huge difference, I know, but the only thing is the M1A1 only used stick magazines. And every time, if any of y'all are major fans of the movie Saving Private Ryan, well, that is technically the historical submachine gun that was used in that time. And I always loved that submachine gun. I don't know why, a little bit more, but I do love the 1928 model. I don't know why, I still do. I think it's because of the fact that these were technically a lot more badass looking, but these things were slightly heavier. Now, one major thing we have to understand that the original 1920s Thompson or Tommy gun was originally the biggest out of the lot. Then came the 1928 model, which was slightly smaller and, well, weighed less. Then came the M1A1 model, which finally came out pretty much for the United States Army somewhere in 1943 and 42. So, yeah, the United States Army kind of got a lot of good shit, while the U.S. Marines kind of got the crap type machinery. But yes, this type of firepower from the M1A1, it would fire somewhere between 600 to 700 rounds a minute. So that's actually not that bad, but it's actually slightly less than the 1928 model. So why did they have to downgrade? Well, one major reason because of this, they did not want to waste ammo because of the fact they got to ship it across the ocean, and two, they wanted to have every round count. Problem is, it's actually stated that for every time you fired on the M1A1, it was less accurate because it just recoiled upward a lot more than it did with the 1928. So we don't know if that's true or not, because I haven't seen much videos of them comparing them, but yeah, because they're different mixed versions, so it's kind of confusing, I know. But their maximum velocity would be somewhere around, I want to say 935 round feet per second, so, or muzzle velocity, or maximum velocity I should say, which that would actually be somewhere between 285 meters a second. Now, its effective range would be somewhere in 164 yards, or in this case, 150 meters. That's actually not that bad for this type of submachine gun, and that's technically with all three of these somewhat, if I remember correctly. But yes, it does fire the 45 ACP, but the original model, as we know it from the 1920s Thompson or Tommy gun, and as well from the 1928, these would be the blowback version. These mean that has an open bolt system. So in other words, when you pull open the cocking handle, it stays that way. You just pull it back and it goes to let loose. While the M1A1 had what you call a breech lock. In other words, it, well, works like a regular submachine gun. It just that pulls back. So I hear many of you already, Templar, why did they do this? Well, as I stated, they wanted to be cheaper and effective. And in fact is, somehow a lot more troops were dying because of the 1928 model somewhat jamming because of the area that it was used in, especially if we take a look at North Africa, especially to the fact that these things had to be extremely oiled when it came to them being made and to be used. So that was kind of the problem. But now, in truth, though, that's kind of the hilarious thing about the M1A1, though. The M1A1 would only get to the United States Marine Corps somewhere in late 1944 and into 1945. And by that point in time, the United States Marines were still using the 1928 model, and they didn't care the difference. The only difference they did matter is if they could still use it. Problem is, there were more 1928s than there were M1A1s, so it was kind of pointless. Now, as I stated, they could use the 50-round drum magazine with the 1928, and as well also the 30-round with a round stick magazine with the 1928 model. And as well, the 100-round model would, 100-round drum mag model would always go with a Tommy gun. But with the M1A1, you can only use 30-round stick mags or a 20-round stick mag, which most of the time was never used. Now, entirely though, this submachine gun, I have heard that many people who use this firearm say it's like firing an M16. So if any of y'all are M16 gun owners and such, this is pretty much one of your guns. Now, however though, there aren't that many guns out there that actually sell the old fully auto design, because apparently it has to be a carbine model, which is kind of a little ruining the gun if you ask me. However, I have heard that people have been able to fire this gun, especially with a 1-round trigger magazine, and in fact this thing is still dangerous with a 45 caliber bullet, or 45 ACP I should say. But the one thing I do have to put out here, y'all, this gun was used dramatically from, well, the 1920s even to the present day. Now, I hear many people already saying, Templar, how the hell has this gun ever been used to the present day? Well, for one, after World War II, it was used in Korea, it was used in Vietnam, the Six-Day War, and as well, it was even used in the invasion of Iraq, but it was used by the Iraqi forces. And the thing is, this submachine gun has been used by many South American countries, South African countries, or as well, pretty much most parts of Africa, the Middle East, India, Mexico, and such and such and such. And it's actually been used by not just the United States Police Force, but also international police forces all across the world. Which, the reason being, they wanted a good submachine gun, rather than relying on some idiot submachine guns that they could get their hands on by their own factories. Now, I have heard that there have been some submachine guns out there that look near identical to this model. I don't know if that is true or not. We don't exactly know. But I have heard that there are this weird model called the Proshka, I think it's called. It's supposed to be a Thompson design model which was designed somewhere in Yugoslavia. I don't know how it is supposed to work, yada yada yada. But apparently it looks like a mix between a Thompson submachine gun and a PPS-841. I don't know if that makes any sense because there is no image of it anywhere online. I've literally tried looking a million times over to find it. However, these three models would not just be the only models, but even there would be the home defense model that was made in 1942 by Thompson. The home defense model was a cheaper construction model, none of which was cheap parts. Literally, there was just cheap parts made for this, just in case if America was ever invaded. And when Japan technically invaded Alaska, for example, that's a good example to it. I already hear many people saying, Templar, Japan never invaded Alaska. Yeah, they did. I'll leave a link down below for Simple History, who actually talk about this in general. And, in fact, this home defense model was made from 1942, was somewhat used there. However, it was a sucky version of a Tommy gun that looked, it's kind of like a cocking handle, it's like right on the back inside. It's kind of like an Owen gun mixed in with a Tommy gun. The only difference is the reason I say this is because the cocking handle is on the side. So it was kind of sucky when it came to firing. That was the only drawback. But we can actually understand of why these submachine guns were technically used. Now, I do hear many of you actually asking me, Templar, how long were these things designed? Well, these would actually first started in design form in the 1917 to 1920s. But that was technically about it. And we don't exactly know on how long the Thompson would have actually been used by the United States Police Force, because we have heard them still somewhat being used by police forces even into the 1990s especially. In fact, if none of y'all remember the college shooting that happened here in Austin, Texas in the 1960s, for example, police forces did have a couple of Tommy guns, but they couldn't reach the opponent from his tower. So that's a good example to it. But one thing we do have to understand is there are some surplus type firearms like this that were manufactured. But the thing is, there are so many of them that were manufactured. There are dozens across the world, and there are also the knockoff models, that of which are just copy design and are not their same design. But now many of you might start asking me, Templar, which gun do you like the most? Well, with me, I like the 1928 model, but I'm also a fan of the M1A1 model because of its size and its tactical use. Now, I've actually seen TBF TV, Hickok 45, using these guns especially. I will leave many of these gun channels down below for y'all, and as well I'll even leave Forgotten Weapons below down for y'all if anyone want to see them. And as well, I think it was Forgotten Weapons or In Range that did a testing rate of fire with the different models. I think it was with the Tommy guns, because they actually tested out the how much muzzle velocity or how many rounds per minute it could fire and how much difference it was, which they did state that the earlier models were probably the better idea, but that's just their opinion. So now I've only fired reenactment versions. I've never fired the real versions for major reasons, because I was technically a little younger, but still. Now, I have heard some people actually going as far as taking replica Thompsons and making them into real working firearms, which don't do that. That is not just illegal, but it's also dangerous. You can accidentally blow off your hands. Like, I have heard some people have done it in the past, so it's not exactly the best thing. But now, there is a huge sound difference when it comes to the Thompsons. Now, let's first actually take a listen to the 1920s Tommy gun and 1928 Thompson, that of which sounds like this. See, now, let's think about that. Now, let's actually hear the M1A1, shall we? Now, if you heard those two, they sound a lot different. That's because the Tommy gun has a, well, massive rate of fire compared to the M1A1, which that's a huge difference. However, I do have to put this out here, y'all. The Thompson is still one of my favorite that fires the 45 ACP, though I'm 50-50 with it with the M3 grease gun for some reasons. So, yeah, it's kind of confusing. But we had used these in Vietnam especially. Now, I have heard from historical tales from veterans of Vietnam that during the early years of the Vietnam War, U.S. forces especially used the M1A1 model. That can actually show how long it was actually used in the United States Army service, especially up until, well, Vietnam. But the thing is, it wasn't just used by U.S. forces, it was used by many allies, especially because of how great of a gun it was. So we can even see that many Middle Eastern countries, as well as African, South American, Canadian, such, have actually still been using these guns as a police firearm or a police submachine gun in order to defeat a bad guy, rather than trust the modern firearm. But now the M1A1 model is entirely probably the coolest version, I think, because every time I think of it, I just think of the 101st Airborne at D-Day, or the Battle of Bulge, or the Big Red 1 at North Africa and such. So that's a good example to it. But now, this Thompson, though, is entirely, well, probably the best of the United States military. But Vietnam was its last years. In fact, we can easily see it in many video games especially, mainly Call of Duty, Sniper Elite. Man of Valor actually does show the Thompson in it, a couple of video game episodes of the video game, but that's about it. But if you don't know what Men of Valor is, it's actually a Vietnam video game and such. But as well, there's also other video games that actually we could see it in, such as Battlefield, Medal of Honor, and so on. And as well, even in many video games, well, they do show them, yes. But we also do see them in many movies, especially Saving Private Ryan, Wind Talkers, such and such, mainly World War II category. But as well, we also hear about them in many series, such as The Pacific or Band of Brothers, which is another good example. But if any of y'all have any type of firearms you want me to cover, please let me know that in the comments below. I'll be happy to look at it for history books' sakes, because I am planning on looking at more submachine guns or rifles or such for the next upcoming videos. If any of y'all have any ideas, as I said, let me know in the comments below, and as well, I'll be happy to get right to it immediately. If any of y'all have any personal ideas I should actually do for the channel, especially, let me know down on Facebook as you message me, which I will leave it down below in the Facebook page type message area. And as well, if any of y'all have any other ideas for the channel, please let me know down in the comments below. And as well, like and subscribe to help the channel grow, and also hit that bell button for the notifications when the next video comes up. Anyways, guys, it's been Templar. Have a great day.